So, in part four of how to negotiate your month off, this last video, we're going to cover kind of what are all of the elements that you want to bring to this conversation and how do we want to frame the conversation. So, we talked about thinking through the challenges and bringing solutions to the table. The other element I want you to consider are w- if there's a challenge it's really tricky and the solution isn't obvious, are there areas where you could compromise? Perhaps compromise on your perfect ideal, 1 month mini retirement, but are there small compromises you could make that are two things? One, low cost to you, like it does not massively negatively impact your mini retirement, but also really impactful for the business or a really effective solution for the business. So, for example, I had a client who was going to take a 3 month mini retirement, but she kind of did like an accounting job and she was the only person that did that job. So, while they could bring in a temp, there was this really tricky challenge that at the end of the month, they reconcile books. And they knew, like, yeah, we're not going to trust that to a temp. So, she made a compromise of at the end of every month for, 5 or 6 hours, I'll come in and I'll reconcile the books myself. So that meant during her 3 month mini retirement, she would have to do 3 days of work, but it didn't interfere with any of her travel plans. It didn't interfere with any of her, other mini retirement plans. So it wasn't a huge cost or detriment to her time off, but it was a massive benefit to the company and a really effective solution for this tricky problem. And I think sometimes, our bosses, HR, we get stuck on these things. One of my friends owns a company that you have to work within a 30-day period to stay on health insurance, which is a little crazy, but it's apparently a health insurance rule. Would you be able to willing to come in for 1 day or to work 1 day during that so that they don't have this huge insurance regulation kind of nightmare that they now have to deal with? Or maybe, there's that Friday morning meeting and no one could imagine how anything would function if you're not at that Friday morning meeting. And you're like, you know what? Yeah, Friday, 9 to 11, I can still show up for that meeting during my month off. It won't interfere with any of my other plans. So if there is oh my gosh, but I don't know how we would resolve this issue, think about, is there a compromise that you could make that, yeah, low cost to you, but really effective in resolving this challenge? The next thing I'm going to look at, if you feel like there's going to be a lot of resistance, but you know what, this really matters to you, this is really important. Maybe this is essential. Maybe this is necessary. You're like, if I don't get this month off, I'm not going to make it. There is a tremendous amount of leverage in a willingness to leave. And the reason that leaving is good leverage is not that you're throwing a tantrum. It's not that you're demanding your way. It's not that you're like, well, if I don't get what I want, I'm leaving. The willingness to leave is leverage because it changes the equation. My dad used to say the easiest solution in the military is just to say no. Whatever problem people bring to you, just say no. It's the fastest and the quickest. And then the problem just goes away. Sometimes we can have this in the corporate world too. If they can just say no, and all of this mental gymnastics and all of these logistics and all of this hassle just goes away, and you're like, okay, thanks, boss, back to work. They might just say no. So the willingness to leave changes the equation because you taking a month off is a little bit of a hassle. It's a little bit of extra work for everyone involved. If the other side of that equation is just they say no, and it's super quick and easy, that's one equation. But if the other side of that equation is you're willing to leave the company, oh my gosh, now it's a massive hassle. It's the hassle of offloading your work, hiring someone new, training someone new. It's overwhelming. You've massively tipped the scale of this equation if you're willing to leave. And there's ways that this doesn't have to be a hard sell. You can kind of just sprinkle it in a little bit. Like, I hate to give up my position here. I'm really hoping we could work something out. Or you know how much I would miss working here. I would love to find a solution that we could make this happen. This dream is really important to me. I prefer not to separate from the company because this has been a wonderful job. So those are kind of a soft sell. Like that, if this doesn't work, there is a possibility that they might separate, and it changes the energy cost equation a little bit. And then that puts the work back on you in that your job is to make you taking a month off the easier, cheaper, simpler solution. How can you orchestrate it in that you taking a month off is clearly the best way to go for everyone involved? Oftentimes we can kind of get stuck in this narrative of like, well, I'm really important and my job's really complicated and I'm essential. They couldn't live without me. The wheels will fall off of this if I'm not there, which you're kind of mentally setting yourself up for, like, there's no way that this could happen. But if you look at it, how do I make this the easiest, the cheapest, the simplest solution from a management perspective, from an HR perspective, and you kind of do that gymnastics, kind of puts you in a different headspace. I was at an event talking about mini retirements and someone raised their hand and they said, yeah, I'm too essential. Like there's no way they would give me a month off. My work is too important. And I said, okay, yeah, that's valid concern. It will make it a little bit trickier. But this person was massively burned out and desperately needed a month off. And I said, well, okay, so in your position, how long would it take for them to replace you, to hire someone new for such an important position? And he was like, oh man, yeah, that would take like 6 months. And I'm like, yeah, it's a long time. How long does it take for the new person to get up to speed to where they potentially could be as effective at their job as you are? And he was like, oh yeah, that's probably another 12 months. And I'm like, okay. So they could either give you a month off or they could suffer in inefficiency and extra work for 12 months. That is the leverage of leaving, but that's also just make you taking a month off the easy, cheap, simple solution so that you get that easy yes. And the last piece of this free workbook for you guys is the first conversation. And that actual conversation starts with a heads up email. Like I said, it's going to be multiple conversations. In this video, I'm not going to walk you through how to structure every single conversation, but I want you to start with a heads up email. This is not something you do a sneak attack. This is not something you spring on someone with no notice. Send a heads up email. And it can sound a little bit like, hey, Sarah, I've got some plans coming up, some thoughts of things that I really want to do in a couple months. I would love if we could meet and talk through some of the logistics of maybe making a leave of absence happen. And because I've walked lots of clients through this, it's terrifying. Like sending that email, like, your pulse is going to go to like 115 and it's so nerve wracking, but it allows your manager to mentally and emotionally prepare and to come into that meeting a little bit more regulated. When people are shocked or angry or dysregulated, we don't think clearly, we don't think creatively, we're just in kind of fight or flight. And so you want to give them that heads up so that they can, and actually I won't go into the whole thing, but there's a little bit, I talk about in the book, a little bit of like the 5 stages of grief. There's like denial and anger, and you want your boss firmly to bargaining by the time you have that first conversation. They can deal with the denial, like, well, this just isn't happening. There's no way they're taking a month off. And they can deal with the anger of like, how dare they? They can deal with all of those emotions on their own time. When they sit down in front of you, we want the energy firmly to be in bargaining. How can we figure this out? Get into that creative, collaborative headspace. So do the bold thing. send the email. And the great thing about a heads up email, and this is like how I encourage my clients and give them that little confidence boost, is this is not the end of the conversation. If you chicken out, if you lose your confidence, if you have a realization you have made a horrible life decision, it is super easy to walk this thing back. It's super easy to be like, yeah, you know what? I was thinking about something. I've changed my mind. I'm fine. I'm happy. We can forget the whole thing. And they'll be relieved. And you've made no commitment. So send that heads up email, get the train in motion, and then you can hopefully very shortly negotiate a month off for your very first mini retirement.